There was a guy that we spoke to, and he's like, I've had my business for over 15 years. This was my worst year. He has like a fruit juice and coconuts that he sells at different swap meets. So it's a very small business, but he's been able to sustain it for over a decade. And he's like, this is the worst time. So that means people aren't buying. You know, his product is more expensive. It's just, he's in the red. And so I think that guy is going to be checking the prices for the fruits that he's selling, you know, the foot traffic, and how many people are willing to spend that money on that coconut that he's going to buy. So that's something that I think, you know, I think about those prices. Like, we think about larger businesses, but I think like here, right, in my neighborhood, we have a señora that sells tamales in her shopping cart. And she's talked about having to switch the type of cups that she uses because they've gotten so expensive. So I think people are going to be like, where's my budget look like? Am I seeing a profit?
¿Qué tal, mi gente? You were just hearing from Cora Cervantes, a multimedia journalist and DEI practitioner, also a fellow colega who I had the pleasure of meeting through the National Association of Hispanic Journalists in our journalistic endeavors together. She's an incredible journalist and has spent a good chunk of the last year in 2024 speaking with working-class Latinos about their businesses and how they see the economic environment in the United States translate to their own firms and ultimately their pocket. Her work has been published by various media outlets, including NBC News, Al Jazeera, NPR's Latino USA, Salon, and Narratively. She's also produced for many of these national outlets, and I do keep up with her work regularly because it heavily impacts our community, covering areas from immigration to politics, race, and ethnicity. Today, we're going to sit down to talk about what she learned while covering Latino business owners and their votes, as well as coverage we can expect to see more of within the Latino community in 2025. No te lo quieres perder. You're listening to Moneda Moves, a podcast where we cover the intersection of money and cultura. I'm your host, Leanne Alfaro, a Latina award-winning journalist, producer, and strategist. On this podcast, I highlight Latinos who are building in the world of business, our relationships with money, and contributions to the American economy. Here we will increase transparency around our dinero issues and achievements of our community, as well as our POC peers, to inspire you to pursue your financial poder. Join me weekly during this season as we cover stories with our communities front and center alongside entrepreneurs and innovators. No te lo quieres perder. Hello, Cora. Welcome to the show.
Hi, nice to be here.
Yeah. I mean, I just saw you a few weeks ago when we're recording this out in LA, and I have to say, Chicago's weather, like winter Arctic, is setting in, and I'm very jealous of the West Coast weather out there.
I mean, West Coast, it is really lovely out here.
That is what they say. But I'm inviting you on the show today because this entire season we're talking to experts, journalists who spend their livelihoods and days and their work covering Latinos and money in particular. And so when I was thinking of folks that cover this population, our population, I thought about you being a member of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, deeply involved in production of stories that come from there, but also, as of right now, NBC News and so many other outlets. I mean, you have Al Jazeera, Latino USA from NPR, Salon, Narratively. And so I'd love for you to take us back and give us a little bit of background into what led you into the coverage of the Latino community in the United States. And then beyond that, how you've come across money stories. Like, what are some of those stories that you've covered?
Sure. So, I mean, what led me into covering these issues was my background. I used to be a community organizer, and I saw how powerful stories could be and how important they are in terms of helping people understand complex systems, and also helping spaces outside of our community understand how we are growing and how we're very much a part of the American polity and economy. And so that led me into journalism because I realized it's a really powerful medium and our stories just aren't there, or they are, but, sadly, too often they miss the mark in terms of who they are booking or what angle or what sound bites. So I just thought, well, let me just try it. And so it worked out. And well, I'm really passionate about storytelling. So it was a great space to elevate these stories any opportunity that I can.
And tell us more, what were you community organizing about? Just thematics.
Oh, so I focused on Latinos and economic development, education reform, immigrant rights, and health disparities. So, just greatest hits here in terms of our
Greatest
community.
hits in terms of working. Yeah, exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, especially when it comes to Latinos, healthcare and the economy are top of mind. And so tell us about looking back on 2024. What were some of the biggest stories that you did in terms of coverage when it comes to the Latino community? You mentioned one which honestly stuck to my head, which was around reporting in the lead up to the election about Latinos across the country. And my first thought was, oh man, how we could have all benefited from being on this, uh, reporting trip with you and really getting to hear from and better understanding our own Latino population across the country and the pressures that they're up against.
Yeah, I mean, I will say this year I did see more coverage about Latinos than I have in previous election cycles. So that was great to see beyond my own reporting. But there's still, I think, areas in terms of like where people are going to interview, the follow-up questions that are asked. And so for me this year, I was just like, hey, I really want to do this. I think that obviously this election was critical in so many ways, both in terms of understanding new turnout patterns, who gets to be in the White House and so on and so forth. And so I decided I wanted to where I worked with two friends and colleagues of mine, Carmen Marquez and Carmen Valencia, and we reached out to the National Association of Hispanic Journalists publication, Palabra. So it was a project that was for Latinos, by Latinos, and for everyone else, but really hoping to center a publication that was run by Latinos, centered on their issues, and that we had the editorial space and freedom to go to the places that we wanted to go to. And I'm not just talking about the states or the cities, but I'm talking about the swap meet or la tiendita que está en esta esquina, and ask questions that we thought were really important, that delved into not only where people's minds were in terms of who they were going to vote for president, but what issues they cared about and why, or why they weren't going to vote, or if it was their first time, or what issues they cared about. And so that's kind of what the project was about. And one layer that I think is really important is media. The media landscape is changing. We wanted to get this project and use it as an opportunity to engage emerging media and to explore traditional media specifically for Latinos. So we did a lot of radio. When we talk about immigrant communities, first gen, they're still listening to the radio in really high numbers, sometimes more than television. And so we wanted to make sure we were radio. We did digital, not only in terms of our written pieces that were on Palabra, but reaching out to other independent journalists that now operate primarily on TikTok and Instagram to do shared reels or lives so that we could reach their audience as well, because there are a lot of Latinos that are going there too. And that whenever we could, tag or flag our friends on television so that they could pick up some of the news gathering that we were doing. And so it was kind of like, how can we just explore and have the freedom to do it, centering it on an issue in a community that we really cared about. And that was
Yeah.
the project.
That's a huge project. And actually, I think that how I caught wind of that Palabra project was I saw a reel and I was just like, oh, I want more. I want more of these sound bites. Because as you said, yes, I agree. I think that there's a big listenership around like anything audible format, not just radio, but also podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
Also, a lot of consumer behavior is gravitating us to the social network. So I think it's very clever that you talk to like influencers, because that's definitely another way like that we're getting information nowadays that's consistently growing. And I mean, it should be an indicator that like both presidential candidates in this last election cycle went to independent media that was podcast audio based, but also video, which gets distributed on social media.
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
and so, from this experience covering Latinos, not just in big cities and rural areas, but to your point, in different in environments that really represent different class of people across the board, what were some of those themes that they hit on and that perhaps folks might find unexpected? Like you said, we know that Latinos really care about the economy. This country really cares about the economy right now, but it's particular in how it hits their pockets, right? Not just what do the reports say according to the experts, and then healthcare. But what else did you find, or any particular nooks and crannies that you found in these two subjects that Latinos are thinking about?
Yeah. So obviously the economy was the biggest thing. The price of eggs, no, people really cared about how their pockets are impacted, whether or not they could buy a home, housing. So much of it did center around the economy, but affordability around different things, quality education for their children, housing, buying a home, being able to afford rent, right? Not just grocery prices, but having aspirations for more. That's really, I would say, the larger theme here, especially for Latino voters that supported Donald Trump. It was very aspirational. It was a proximity to something more than what they have right now. You know, they you know, people kept on talking, we just want things to get better. We just want things to get better. And so it really was just oddly enough, in some ways, it felt like 2008. There was a lot of hope behind that vote of maybe I will be able to afford a home now. Maybe I will be able to adjust my status. There were people that voted for this candidate, or I guess President-elect Trump, because of immigration reform, which is really surprising given the policies that have been pushed. There are people that said, no, he's really good for us. I'm voting for him because he's going to be really great for reform. He wants to clean house, and then everybody that's been here for a long time, we will be able to figure something out for them. And so that was very surprising to me. Or that they were really big on securing the border from a human rights standpoint. There were conservative Latinos that said we're really worried about human trafficking and the circumstances that people are experiencing, or we want to see an improved relationship with Mexico. They were worried that there was a shift in presidency, so there needed to be a stronger leadership in the United States, and they felt this person that was a man maybe would capture that better. So there were a lot of different layers to it, but it was still centered on a lot of hope, which is not something that maybe people would expect, but even in 2017, I covered the inauguration. And I remember someone saying then, they were coming someone from the Midwest, and they talked about how their grandfather, their husband, their brother had lost their jobs. And the person said to me, it was a woman, she said, I voted for Donald Trump because just like people wanted and felt hope in 2008, we're entitled to feel that hope too, and I'm hopeful. And so it was interesting to see that reflected within Latino voters as well.
Let's talk about a little about like the reports that are released at a higher level and how you found that Latinos are experiencing it, and maybe what kind of Latinos in particular that were experiencing it in this way, because there's a couple of layers to this, right? There's the briefs that were released by the Biden-Harris administration. For example, one showing that since 2020 Q4, GDP had risen 12.6%. Meanwhile, we have economists saying that inflation has actually leveled out, that unemployment numbers are settling in. But increasingly we see that people on the ground are not really experiencing it that way. So talk to me about like the discrepancy that we're seeing here between like these high level numbers that almost might be like just out of touch for people that are experiencing a very different reality on the ground, and the kind of reality you already told us about, the reality that they're experiencing, but more about the perception that they have of these bigger numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because people did articulate this. There was a young Latino, a small business owner that we met at a swap meet, at the Great Acre swap meet in Las Vegas. And he said exactly what you said. He said, I'm voting for Harris because the markets are doing great. We're being told about this, about that. He's like, we're just waiting for it to trickle down here. I want to see it trickle down here. And I think there's different layers to it. I think one, Latinos operate within different layers of class and access within their own communities, in terms of like, there's first gen, Latinos that are able to purchase a home, and then there are like third gens that are not, right? For different reasons. So there's just different dynamics that are playing out. And so it has to do with financial literacy, which is impacted by your buying power, is also impacted, right, by your credit score, by your savings, your investments. And so people have figured out different ways to do it within their respective smaller Latino communities. And so some of them are seeing the impact of these changes that the Biden administration implemented, and some may not. It also is what outreach efforts were made, what awareness do people have about programs, how are organizations disseminating this information, how are parties disseminating this information and these resources to buy a home, to open a business. I can't say that they are or they aren't fully, but from anecdotal, I guess, observations, there seems to be a huge disconnect. If you talk to people, they're not quite, they can't pinpoint what benefits have come out of the administration. Not that
Yeah.
there haven't been, they can't articulate them or point to them.
Yeah, they can't feel them in their everyday lives. And that's something really good to call out, because in that, something that like was really worth discussing is then, where is like mainstream media and media at all levels at this point, because
Mm-hmm,
even
mm-hmm.
non-traditional mainstream media is becoming mainstream, and so we all share the same responsibility. Where is it that Latinos aren't, did you find like Latinos aren't being covered, where like you went into spaces where you're just like, hey, this isn't the main line we're representing about Latinos at the top level, like, and I had another interview during this season where I had another journalist say, hey, we need to get more specific about who we're talking about here, because Latinos
Mm-hmm.
includes all sorts of class, all sorts of background, country of origin, proximity to that country of origin, depending on generation. So where is it like that we're missing in that broad stroke, where like mass media that with influence at this point, not just mass media, needs to really pay attention to?
I think it's there. You mentioned media, but I think it's too. I think government or political parties aren't telling their story right either. And so I think on that end, you need to think about who is in that space that is speaking for the community, that is coming up with this messaging that then is reverberating to media, that is letting them know what is important to cover from an official source standpoint, because journalists cover the official source. So if they're covering the White House, and like White House say is inviting particular outlets versus others they may not be inviting, or leadership from different organizations that they may not be including in the room, that may have the ear of a particular Latino constituency. So that's one layer that's important when we think about the sources that journalists cite in their stories. So there's already something to look at there. Who are the gatekeepers? Who are the storytellers? Who are the cultural brokers, if you may, in those spaces that are speaking for the community? And are they missing the mark? And I mean, I think that's a big question for these parties to ask themselves post-election. Are the doors that we're opening really reaching that second gen Latina high school graduate who may not be tuning in to Meet the Press on Sunday, who may be, I don't know, getting her information somewhere else. So that's one. And then from a media standpoint, I think that, yeah, there's a big thing. Like, I have been in I've worked on stories where we're talking about the housing crisis and they provide the large number for everybody. And I've said, hey, that shouldn't be our graphic. Our graphic should be broken down by race, because housing accessibility or affordability looks different for a Black family and Latino family than a white or an Asian American family. So that big number that you're showing isn't really telling the story. This neighborhood that you're going to isn't the best example, but depending on the outlet, they have an audience. So their audience is the person they're speaking to. And if we look at ad buys and a lot of things, and specifically in news, I don't think that the Latino audience is seen the same way in terms of their buying power, despite how powerful it is. And so that does impact the way that it is covered. The amount of stories that are out there, the way that something as simple as a graphic is included, the expert that they're booking to talk about something may not speak from an equity lens. It may be a mainstream lens. But the thing is, mainstream looks very different now. And so when outlets are toggling between keeping their old traditional audience because they want to hang on to it while things are changing, they are
Yeah.
missing out on this other audience that's decided that they're gonna go on their phone and go to social media and TikTok and Instagram
And that
or
tends to be
to the
Latinos because we're digital
hmm
natives and because we tend to
exactly.
be young. Yeah, no, I mean you're drawing the lines between the dots here that like we really need to take a look at. And so I'm curious, you mentioned that financial literacy was a one that people really seem to need. What are some of those other gaps that are preventing Latinos? So you mentioned a few of them, but could you list them for us? Like financial literacy, like what are some of those gaps and how are Latinos filling them between the lines for themselves because maybe there isn't like a systemic way to provide financial literacy?
Yeah, and so that I think part of it is also, you and I have spoken about where I told you like I love these videos that are like in the fintech space online that are telling me, oh, invest here, or like I love Snowball, or a lot of these spaces that are telling you, oh, you can do this, or this is how you can get out of debt. That speaks to me as a college educated Latino immigrant parents. That resonates with the income that I have access to with my toolbox.
Mm-hmm.
But my mom's toolbox looks completely different than mine. Doña Rosa over here in the corner, her toolbox, she's not looking up snowball videos. So I think there's
They're on
also,
WhatsApp.
yeah, she's getting the little Tweety Bird, the good morning message and all this
Mhm.
misinformation that's wrapped in there that, unfortunately is causing Latinos to fall prey to scams sometimes. So I think part of it's not only financial literacy, but digital discernment is a tool that's
So
really
media
important.
media literacy.
Media literacy, yes, but also even beyond it. Like there's people that are getting random text messages that are spam that they're clicking on, that are causing
Yeah.
them to send their money to places that are not safe.
Mm-hmm.
That the immigrant communities fall prey to that. There are issues even when you talk about attorneys, people going to notarios, and seeing them in the same light as attorneys. And there's been entire campaigns over time to help shift that because it's cultural in some ways, from like the trust we deposit in people to the things that we think are important. Like, for example, that's why a lot of families that I know, they don't have investment portfolios. They buy life insurance. They buy life insurance for their kids. And for example, they may not know, oh, well, like buy this insurance, I can leverage it, without having it cashed out after I pass, right? So there's all these like different little things that people may not know because they're relying on others to tell them. And so literacy looks different for you, for me, for your parents, for my parents, for my neighbors. And so it's really being able to break that down because I can't sit and talk to my mom about a Roth IRA. I mean, I can and I will and I do, but there's other
Same here.
conversations that need to happen. Like I think about it from a community organizing lens. I eventually might be able to have a session where I talk about a Roth, right? But way before that, there's one that talk about how to open up a bank account, how to not rely on like those check cashing spaces, right? Or payday loans. So I think because it's such a large space of conversation, it's realizing that there are different audiences that we are reaching. So from a journalism standpoint, we say, well, know your audience. Who is your audience? I think we need to understand that Latinos are multiple audiences. I think
Mm-hmm.
there are common threads. I think we've done ourselves a disservice by saying we are not a monolith because in some ways, like I told my colleague, you go to Las Vegas, you go to Phoenix, and there are things that translate as Latinos. So there is a common thread that runs there. It may be more about class or a combination of immigrant experience. I cannot say, but there is that. But also, there's, to your point, proximity to the border, proximity to whiteness, proximity to specific income brackets. All of these things need to be thought out more.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is a resounding like theme that I'm hearing again and again this season that like we are made of different audiences. And for so long we've talked about the power of us together. I think it's important to better understand each other through understanding what sets us apart and like not in a divisive way, but to actually better get each other and know
Mm-hmm,
where we're
mm-hmm.
coming from. And perhaps that could bring us together as well.
Totally.
Yeah. So you mentioned that there's a lot of hope in the people that you interviewed, which I think was such a, like, it's something that's like, it's going to be like quote that's going to be floating around in my head for a bit. And that reminded you of 2008. In 2025, what are some of the people that you interviewed? What are they going to be looking for when it relates to money to prove out that hope that lives in their mind?
Jobs. That's going to be a big one. Jobs, their abilities to sustain their businesses. Like there was a guy that we spoke to, and he's like, I've had my business for over 15 years. This was my worst year. He has like a fruit juice and coconuts that he sells at different swap meets. So it's a very small business, but he's been able to sustain it for over a decade. And he's like,
Right.
this is the worst time. So that means people aren't buying. His product is more expensive. It's just he's in the red. And so I think that guy is going to be checking the prices for the fruits that he's selling, the foot traffic, and how many people are willing to spend that money on that coconut that he's going to buy. So that's something that I think, I think about those prices. Like we think about larger businesses, but I think like here, right? In my neighborhood, we have a señora that sells tamales in her shopping cart. And she's talked about having to switch the type of cups that she uses because they've gotten so expensive. So I think people are going to be like, what does my budget look like? Am I seeing a profit?
Right.
I think for people that really care about grocery prices, which we all should, but some of us are very fortunate to have a different understanding of how these prices work. But for families that make a clear connection or have established in their mind a connection between the White House and the price of their groceries, they're going to be looking at those grocery prices. Are things cheaper? When I fill my tank, is it like how much am I spending? So it's literally in their wallet. They want to see how much money is there and how much isn't.
Yeah. And let me ask you a question on that, just based on what you see. I mean, Marketplace put out a end of the year recap at the end of 2024, which is when we're recording now, talking about how this incoming administration does want to do away, like it wants to limit immigration. And so drawing that line between that and how much immigrant labor we have in the United States, especially when it comes to produce, which lands in our grocery stores,
Mm-hmm.
and how not hiring immigrants could result, because of the way things work, not that they should, but because of the way that they do, and those immigrants get paid lower wage than perhaps somebody domestic would, almost certainly, that it'll drive up the price of groceries. Have you had any conversations around that or any reporting around that that could be a tell for like what might happen?
Well, I think that'll be that's the inconvenient truth of American labor, and things cost what they cost. And I mean, we went out to the fields and we spoke to farm workers who, oddly enough, also supported Donald Trump. Unexpected, completely. That's not where I thought that conversation was going to go. Also aspirational. I think the people that are hopeful for some type of reform will have to see, if there is something or if it's a mass deportation, which is what the Trump administration has said is their plan. And so then what is the impact, what is that impact on our labor force? And then how does that impact our food prices? And we know that there is a connection, but it may require people to feel it, and I don't know how long that'll take and at what cost. And I
Yeah.
think that's the toughest part of that conversation, that there's a human cost to maybe people realizing that, these people in the fields that are people just like you and I that are making the wages they're making, have a direct impact on our foods. And we saw that during COVID very clearly, right? But I don't think it's set in from an economic standpoint. And we'll see, there's parts of Florida that have already felt that because of state policy, that they say they don't have enough laborers to pick produce. So what will that look like in the salad bowl here in California, or, in the winter salad bowl in Arizona? We don't know yet.
Mm. So something to definitely watch. It's interesting to talk about the parallel of like in-person immigrant labor while also still acknowledging that digital labor that is not from the US is on the rise. You see a lot of tech companies increasingly hiring talent from abroad that doesn't require talent to be physically in the United States. But I mean, you see this with startups. People employ professionals, engineers in Colombia, in Costa Rica all the time, in other LATAM countries because of the rates that they're afforded to. So I am curious to see what would happen if there are mass deportations and therefore we don't have physical immigrant labor here that's driving down those prices for things like produce, but it's driving down prices for things like digital talent that are hired abroad. So, Cora, any comments on that, first of all, before I...
Well, I mean, I think, it's this larger conversation about fair wages and labor rights, and what that looks like at the transnational level. The United States does also play a role in that. I just attended a convening Raizado, and there was, Joaquin Castro had Representative Castro, he had a whole panel talking about that, about the role the U.S. plays in Latin America in terms of shedding light on fair wages and the treatment of workers that are working there on behalf of U.S. companies, and ensuring that the values and rights that exist here in the U.S. that can still obviously be reformed for the better are still, steps ahead of the way that people are being treated in Latin America and other parts of the world. And so it's all connected, it's the same companies. And many, when we think about some of these things, these companies own a lot of other companies. And, these are wage conversations and policies that are important to have.
Absolutely. I mean, it's something that I'm also watching because I think about, I mean, we're both Mexican American. I think of Mexico and how they're trying to take back the corn production, whereas farmers that used to grow their own corn, a huge diversity of corn in Mexico, from indigenous communities from way back when, started buying GMO seeds for corn because it monopolized so much of the corn production in Mexico. And now finally AMLO has taken a stand and said, we're taking back this production. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious to see, as globalization continues, I'm curious to see how some countries take back their own production as well, like Mexico is in the process of doing.
Yeah, that's one that'll be really interesting to watch. I'm fascinated by it too, from a land rights standpoint, right? From a food justice standpoint, from a health equity standpoint. There's so much wrapped in that. So it'll be interesting with, Mexico's new president and the incoming president in the United States, what that conversation will look like.
Absolutely. And since we're briefly touching on that topic of fair wages, of also, we didn't particularly talk about Latinas, but I'm going to introduce it now. We're talking about Latinas. One of the big topics that we covered towards the end of the last season was around the Latina wage gap. In 2024, it widened for the first time in 20 years. And so we had Monica Ramirez on, who's an attorney activist, also leads at Raizado Festival, which you mentioned, speaking to how she's, first of all, led in many ways on the LEPD, Latina Equal Pay Day front, for 10 years and more than a decade, and still sees some of the similar threads. And I'm curious, in your experience from speaking with Latinas, be it business owners or not, like, what are you seeing are some of the uphill battles that they're facing when it comes to achieving equitable pay?
Well, I have to say, I mean, as before I share that, I just want to give a big shout out to Latinas, because if there was one, I guess, really shiny example of hope and, just for the Latino community, it was Latinas across the United States, whether it was all the businesses that were open, the commitment to get out the vote. I met so many amazing Latinas doing work to change policy at the local level, at the state level, to get on school boards and, PTAs and state legislatures. So yes, there's a huge gap that needs to be addressed, but wow, really, it's just hacen tanto con tan poquito. So much is done with so little, and it's so impressive, the level of ingenuity and resilience that, I think amid a lot of different conversations I had the space where I felt a lot of hope and excitement was from a lot of Latinos that I spoke to and that I've met in just in the last year. But that wage gap persists, and it's a really big problem. And hopefully every year there is more awareness so that, we understand that just because you may not feel it directly, it doesn't mean it's not happening over time, and that these are important conversations to have. Just like, I think salary transparency between colleagues is important. These larger conversations are incredibly important because it's the difference between you being able to buy a home, being able to take care of your parents through their retirement, taking care of your own retirement, paying off a car. It's so much, and so, props to Monica for all the work that she does to advance equal pay for Latinas, because it is absolutely unacceptable to see those numbers. And I've witnessed spaces where I've seen men make, significantly more than women. And if you factor in race and ethnicity, those numbers are really unjust.
Yeah. So something I definitely heard from what you just said is, first of all, you're absolutely right. It is so wrong that we're still facing this big discrepancy, and that it is real, that it is happening, and it's not simply because of the careers that Latinas choose, which is kind of a discrediting rationale that sometimes we hear about these things. But I also heard that pay transparency is so important, right? And so I do think I have been seeing more people in the workforce sharing, and not just in the workforce, but because now 2 in 5 Americans are part of the gig economy, sharing how much they get paid for contracts. And I do feel like from a grassroots level, it's super important to see that. And it's great to see that level of transparency so that people can go and demand an equitable pay for the same quality and caliber of work.
And also that we can lean on each other to learn how to advocate for ourselves, to negotiate a salary increase, or, just a different title, or, different things that help to move that needle forward.
Yeah. More people believing that the pie does truly get bigger when you come together versus there's a limited share of the pie and only a few people get to get it.
Mm-hmm.
Cora, a question that I ask everyone on the podcast, and I'm so curious to see how you'll respond to this one, is about your biggest personal money move. What was yours?
Well, I think, a couple of years, the biggest one for me, I think money is emotional. As much as it's numbers, it's also very emotional. So it was giving myself the tools to figure out how to retire my parents while I take care of my own retirement, in a way that opened up a lot of conversations about money in my home. So, it really was that, I talked about the life insurance, but it meant sitting down with my family and opening up all these random manila folders that, we had, and figuring out that our financial state as a family, and thinking about our collective game plan so that I could have the things that my parents dreamed for me to have, and I could have the peace of mind that my parents have, what I wish for them to have. And so, it's giving myself the I guess the calm to tackle all this, like, things that make me a little anxious, in a way that there's a path forward for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I commend you on that, because it is not easy. And you're right, it is emotional. I mean, it's one thing to handle your own emotions, but handling your parents' emotions is a whole therapy session. I've had experience with that as well. So I definitely commend you on tackling it head on, right? And having real conversations about it, because that's what it takes in order to set the plans in motion. So thank you so much for sharing all your experience and coverage, and for also taking initiative in your life on a personal level, and sharing how you're doing it with us, with your family. And yeah, just really looking forward to seeing all of what's to come in 2025, how Latinos continue to leverage their resiliency, their community building, their grassroots efforts to level up, but also to see how things will shake up at a higher level as well.
Absolutely. We'll all be tuned in. Thank you so much for creating this space to have a conversation.
Thanks, Cora. Thank you, mi gente, for joining us this week on Moneda Moves. Before you go, please make sure to hit follow on this podcast so you can receive new episodes right when they are released. You can follow right now in the app you're using to listen to this podcast.
Also, continue keeping cuentas and keeping tabs on our Latinx community and Money Moves via our free newsletter written by yours truly at monedamoves.substack.com. That's monedamoves.substack.com. I'll see you there. Hasta la próxima.